Go fill up and then try to stay away. How are you? Give me a minute to get situated for something. There's a lot of commotion going on back there. Okay, Philip's here, so it's time for us to start. Again. Yeah, I know. I've still got a little bit of time. Good evening, everybody. We do have a lot who are out. We do have some who are here, and they're slowly coming in through the doors, so that's fine. It's that kind of Wednesday. But I hope everyone's had a good week. Jacob got good news from his doctor's visit. He said he'll still be with us. I was like, oh, yeah. But no, everything checked out fine. Did get a little bit of update with Dad. He did have a doctor's appointment. They talked to him about getting put on a transplant list. So they said probably within a week or so he'll be able to know a little bit more about that. But we're a little optimistic that we will find someone for the donor. I am not his blood type, so I cannot be the donor. I think it's O positive, I think so. Which he likes SpaghettiOs and Cheerios and Honey Nut Cheerios, so that makes sense. Be praying for that. We're hoping that there can be a donor become available, even though that's a lengthy process. Outside of that, there's nothing bad that has happened this week, per se, that I know of. I know Hazel was taken home today. Polly had messaged me and told me she's now back. Actually, there is one thing. Jackie still feels a little bad, but keep praying for her. She's a little better, but still not quite there, and I think Bart has something to do with it. But be praying for Angel. Bart was telling Lum that she wasn't feeling too well tonight, so she would have been here otherwise. So be praying for her that she can be well again. Outside of that, I don't have anything. If you didn't get one of the sheets on the podium out there, you might need one. It's going to be a little bit of a lecture tonight. We're going to be looking a lot through the Bible, looking at passages. So I can get you up to par to where we need to be, where we start chapter 1, Lord willing, next week. But I'll give it a few seconds. If you don't like a lot of information, you don't need this piece of paper. Oh my! Well, yeah, probably, and especially to go through it all. But we'll ask Lum if he can lead us in an opening prayer, and then we'll begin.
Father, we thank you for this opportunity to have together once again in this midweek Bible study. We thank you, Father, that we have your word to look to for our guidance. We thank you, Father, for the purity of it, the truth of the sin. We know, Father, that if we follow it holy, that we have a home in heaven rather than this world. We thank you, Father, that your Son was able to come to earth, live among men, but most of all, we're thankful that he died on that cruel cross for our sins. I thank thee, Father, also that we have his great example of how we should live. I pray, Father, that we truly try to copy big things that he did. We know, Father, he can be fruitful not only in our lives, but we become those that we need to reach out to in this world and need to know the gospel. Pray, Father, you be with us as a congregation. Help us that we can always be able to meet here, that we can always be in peace, and nobody will ever cover our freedom. And with that, Father, we pray for the leaders of our country. We pray, Father, that they will do the things more with your will than the things that we've had in the past. We pray, Father, for leaders in other countries as well, Father, that freedom can exist so people can reach out to you. We pray, Father, for those that are sick in our congregation, those that were mentioned here. We pray for that, you know, that they're in our minds and our thoughts every day. We pray, Father, that those can be comforted and be upheld and that help them to get better. We pray, Father, for those that may be getting ready to undergo procedures. We pray, Father, that they be successful as well. We pray, Father, you'll be with us through this Bible study through the rest of this day and help keep us true to your will the best we can keep it. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Did you hear anything about Jim?
Oh, I did not hear anything about his surgery. I guess they didn't give him medication afterwards because he's not here. He did bring his TV box, though, so I think he did that before surgery because I was welcomed with a brand new TV box with no TV.
Was it outpatient surgery
No, replacement, probably not. I don't think
No. He said he'd be a day or so in the hospital, then come back. But that's all we know right now. Yeah, he'll have to do rehab after a while. Then after that, then he starts some treatments after that. But that's all that I know of right now. Okay, that'd be good. So if you have your Bible, open up to Revelation 17. We're going to be looking more into the scriptures this evening, and I'm also going to give a little bit of a historical talk tonight. Last week we talked about 3 things that we need to realize as we go through the book of Revelation, and we talked about how we should interpret it, how we should not approach Revelation, and some of the things we need to become aware of before we even dive into the book, such as Old Testament prophecy, what were the people in the first century looking forward to. And the reason I want to start in chapter 17, there's a verse that we need to keep in mind. We need to realize, and we talked about this last week as well, the book of Revelation was written to an audience in the first century. And throughout the book of Revelation, there's a couple of verses that kind of give us some time indications of either when an event transpires, or when the book was written, or it might be something in the near future, and John's just seeing something at a particular time that's going to take place later on. And the reason I say that, in Revelation 17, he sees this image of a woman on a beast, and it says, starting to explain what he's seeing in verse 9 and 10. It would say, the kings of the earth, hold on, I'm in 18. Let's try this again. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And there are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. Now, what we want to look at tonight is, who are these kings? What time period is John actually making reference to? And is there a way that we can look through the Bible that'll give us a better understanding of where are we during the time that John is writing all of this? Now again, because the book of Revelation is visionary, it's just visions and images, John could be looking at an event in chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, something that's going to occur into the future, and then maybe in chapter 11 or 12 or even 17, it might shoot back to present time that John is writing it. That's where we've got to be very, very careful as we're reading through the book. What's going on? What is God hinting at? What is John trying to say? And considering the verbs that are used in verse 10, he would say there are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, past tense. 1 is, present tense. And the other has not yet come, future tense. And if you look at verse 11, it's not on the page, but in verse 11 it talks about this 8th beast who is not yet come. But when he does come, he'll go to perdition. So what we're seeing is Revelation will use past, present, and future tense verbs, and those are the things we really need to become aware of. But If we were to say we're talking to someone and they believe that, well, Revelation is about the coming 1,000-year reign where Christ is going to come to earth, he's going to rule, Satan's going to be cast down into the bottomless pit, and then after that 1,000 years, Satan's going to roam around for 1,000 years. Well, that means that Christ is going to reign for at least 2,000 years till Satan is thrown off. So maybe 2,000 plus years once Christ returns. And the problem we have if we take that kind of approach going into Revelation is we're taking a lot of people's ideas of what the book of Revelation might be about, and we kind of make it this futuristic book. Some people think Revelation happened in the past, and there's nothing about the book that we can take application from. I don't think that's the case. There are things that we can take in application, but I think a lot of the events surrounding Revelation have already occurred for the most part. The only thing we fail at as we go through the book is we don't know how to identify what's the writer talking about, what's the context of the audience. Well, let's go back to the Old Testament first, and I want us to look at two different visions, one from Nebuchadnezzar and the other from Daniel. And I want us to keep these visions in mind as we go throughout the book. The first one's going to be in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. And again, as we're going through the historical aspect, if we have a better understanding of what's going on when Christ came onto the scene, I think it's Galatians chapter 4 and even Ephesians 1. It talks about in the fullness of time, God sent His Son. Well, when did God send His Son? Historically, Jesus was born about, people want to say 0 or 1 AD. He was born about 5 or 4 BC, based on a couple of historical evidences. But who was the king during that time? What was the empire during that time? And if we studied first century culture, we would know the Roman Empire's under consideration. But how can we prove that? Biblically. This is where the fun part comes in. So Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a terrible dream, or at least he thinks it's a terrible dream. And if you remember in the Old Testament time, the children of Israel, they were promised under the old law, if they were to keep the law, God would bless them with the land. He would bless their king. He would bless their crops, and nothing bad would happen. You go through Saul. He wasn't that great of a king. Up comes David. He was okay. He made a couple of mistakes. Then you have Solomon. Solomon's heart was chased after the gods of his wives. And then you have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. The divided kingdom comes about, and the united monarchy becomes divided. You have the northern kingdom, southern kingdom. And what happens to both of those kingdoms? Yeah, they go into bondage. One to Assyria, and then the other one ultimately to Babylon, and then Babylon destroys and decimates the Assyrian power. But in the Babylonian captivity, Nebuchadnezzar is a name that comes up in 2 Chronicles. I want to say it's 36, or it might be 32 and beyond. The last 5 chapters, practically. Zedekiah makes a really bad bargain and tries to annihilate the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar hears about it. He breaks a treaty that he made with the king of Jerusalem, and he ends up taking all the people into captivity. So in Daniel, we find Daniel is one of the children of the kings of the southern kingdom, and we find in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a bad dream. Now, we're not going to read the entire chapter. I guess we could start in verse 24. That'll work. Okay, so Daniel's going to come to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar says, "Tell me the dream." Daniel asks God, and God reveals the dream to Daniel, and it says down in verse 29. "As for thee, O king, thy thoughts that came to thee while thy mind was on your bed, about what would come to pass after this, and he who reveals secret has made known to you what will be. But as for me, the secret has not been revealed to me, because I have more wisdom than anyone living. But for our sakes, who make known the interpretation to the king, that you may know the thoughts. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of clay and iron. And you watched a stone that was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and of clay and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff in the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now Daniel's going to explain what this dream means. He just told Nebuchadnezzar the dream without even asking Nebuchadnezzar. That's part of how God was revealing his power through Daniel. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, and strength. It's interesting, verse 40, it specifies and focuses on this fourth kingdom that's going to come up after the Babylonians. The fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and will crush all others. Whereas you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And the toes of the feet were partly of iron and part of clay. So the kingdom, that particular fourth kingdom, shall be partly strong and partly fragile. Now he would say in verse 43 a few more things about this kingdom. And in verse 44 he says, in the days of these kings. Which king? The kingdom that's in consideration, the fourth kingdom. In the days of the fourth kingdom, there shall come a kingdom which God will set up, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone which was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is true. Now, if you have the piece of paper, I want you to look at the different kingdoms that are mentioned through here, even though they're not specific in this text. And even if you go to Daniel chapter 7, Daniel's going to have a different kind of vision. He's going to see these different creatures, a lion, a bear of sorts, an eagle, kind of leopard-looking thing, and then this monstrosity of a beast. However you could describe it, I don't really know what creature it would affiliate with, but it also represents the four distinct kingdoms, one being Babylon, the other three being representative of whatever nations are going to come up after Babylon. But there's more specific texts that we can look at. And what I want to look at specifically, go over to chapter 5. Chapter 5, we're going to find the son of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar. He's going to be holding a feast. And if you recall this particular image, he had taken some of the vessels of the temple and he was using them for his party. This hand comes up and it starts writing this word, many, many tickle you farson. And basically it's, you have been weighed, you have been measured, God has found you guilty, your kingdom's going to be taken away from you. Look down at verse 28. It would say, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. You go down to the last two verses of the chapter, verse 30 and 31. In that night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, another name for Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The second kingdom that's coming after the Babylonian Empire is actually a conjoined empire. It starts out as the Medes, but eventually this other group from the far east called the Persians is going to come into play. And when you go through the book of Esther, you're going to read about these Persians, you're going to read about these Medes and their conjoined power. And over a period of time, these Medes and Persians are trying to fluctuate and balance this power, but it doesn't work. In fact, there's going to be another vision that's going to come up. Look in chapter 8. Chapter 8, there's going to be a vision of a ram and a goat. Now, the Babylonians have already been taken over. Medes and Persians are in power, but then there's another vision where this ram is going to be fighting this goat. And in fact, if you look in verse 19 and 20, it would say, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last times, the indignation for the appointed time of the end shall be. The ram which you saw having two horns, they are the kings of Media, or Medes, and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. That's very specific. So now we have the identity of our third kingdom, the Grecians. Now what's interesting, if you go through Daniel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and what's interesting about Isaiah, when he's making mention of the Grecians, the Isaiah 44:28 and the 45:1 talks about my servant Cyrus. Well, Cyrus was a Mede. Some call him Cyrus a Persian, but he's really a Mede. But the Grecians are going to take over. And when we talk about the great nation of Greece, who's like the number one conqueror from the Grecians? Something with the no good, very bad, bad day, or terrible day. Alexander, for Greece. We're not quite Rome yet. For the Grecians. Now, Alexander the Great was a fantastic conqueror. In fact, even though this is supposed to represent most of Rome, Alexander had conquered all of this and even further off to the east. He was a fantastic conqueror at a young age. Some people say either he drank poison from a particular general of his, or he caught some kind of foot virus and he just never got over it. But on his deathbed, and if you continue reading through chapter 8, it's actually going to say something to the extent of this particular kingdom, and even in chapter 10, is going to be split into 4 different parts. And these kingdoms aren't going to be as strong as they were when they were unified under one. And when you look into history, that's exactly what happened. When Alexander the Great died, his kingdom went to his top 4 generals. And they couldn't get along. And that's what led to the demise of the Grecian Empire. Now, even though it's not mentioned by name, the 4th empire is the empire that's going to come to pass when, look at Daniel 7. In verse 9, when this 4th kingdom is in place, there's going to be one who's going to come in called the Ancient of Days. Daniel would write, this is Daniel 7 verse 9. I watched till the thrones were put in place and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow and the hair of his head was as pure as wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire, a fiery streamed issue, and it came forth before him. Look down at verse 11. The Ancient of Days, as Daniel was watching, then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn that was against the Ancient of Days was speaking, I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed, giving to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season. And I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming in the clouds of heaven, he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him before him. Then was given to him dominion, glory, kingdom. Then all the peoples, nations, languages should serve him, and his dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. I'm reminded of a certain text that Jesus was speaking to Peter in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. What did he tell Peter and the other disciples? Upon this rock, I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades or hell shall not prevail against it. It's interesting, this 4th kingdom, this last kingdom, this Son of Man, this Ancient of Days is going to come into play. And this is something we're going to see in chapter 1 of Revelation as well. This image of a resurrected Jesus whose hair is white as wool and his body is glowing and shimmering like the sun. His eyes are red as fire, and when he speaks it's like the voice of sound of many waters or these great trumpets sounding. And basically it's this same image of the Ancient of Days that Daniel just referenced. Whatever's going to happen during the time of Revelation, it has to be during the time of this 4th kingdom after the kingdom of Greece. Now, when the Grecian Empire fell, when Mark Antony and Cleopatra had died down in Alexandria, down here in the bottom right, there was a new kid coming to town. In fact, this was a kid, according to the paper in history, this is a kid who was formed as a republic from about, I think, 500 BC to 27 BC, till this individual by the name of Caesar comes to play. This Roman Republic, where these people are voted for different sides and they represent the people, some representing the poor class, some the rich class, and some even representing those in the government positions. They were doing the kind of elections that we see today. It's based on a voting democratic process. By 27 BC, that process was thrown away and the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire. This is where we start to see as you get into the New Testament. Look over at Luke chapter 2. When you go into the New Testament and you begin in the times of Christ, it's going to give you a couple of context clues as to when exactly all this is happening. And when you look at Luke chapter 2, it gives an interesting name in verse 1. It would say, "It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus." This was the first Caesar, not necessarily Julius Caesar, though Julius Caesar was kind of the end of the Roman Republic. Augustus Caesar is going to be the first emperor that we know of, and that history would account for being the first emperor of the Roman Empire. After this, if you look into chapter 3, we're given another name, and we might be more familiar with the second name that comes up here, and even the third name. Now, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, history would come to show that when Augustus Caesar had died, his son took the throne. This is Tiberius. But then it gives us other character names such as Pontius Pilate or Herod. And there's different Herods that would take place during the time of Christ. Herod being a tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip. This again is another Herod, tetrarch of Iturea, the region of Trachonitis, and Lysinus, tetrarch of Abilene. Now, it's not Abilene College, but it's interesting. These names give us a historical timestamp. And it also gives us a timestamp of when Jesus began his ministry. Now, if we were to go throughout Roman history, we're going to find, and you can see it on this piece of paper, if you look at the biblical evidence of the Roman Empire pre-Revelation, there are a couple of government officials that we know of and some that we don't know of, even Caesars that are mentioned throughout the New Testament. We already read Augustus Caesar and Tiberius Caesar. Claudius Caesar, he was the one who had actually banished the Jews from Rome, and that's probably how Paul met, what's the couple's name? It left me. Yes, met them over in Athens in Acts chapter 17 and 18, where it makes mention of that in chapter 18. We wouldn't know that if Luke didn't feel like it was needful. And then we're also referenced to another individual. You look at the end of the book of Acts, it mentions Nero. Now, it may not mention him specifically, but it does mention Caesar. Had this man not appealed to Caesar, he may have been released. That would have been Nero. Lo and behold, history would say Paul died by the hands of Nero. We're not really sure. But historically, this gives us a timeline. Throughout the book of Acts, we're seeing time, or at least history, the way that we read in the history books in public schools or even home schools. We're seeing history take place. And as this timeline is shifting through the New Testament, this land over here on the far right is no longer our focus point through the New Testament, but rather it's showing the gospel come closer and closer and closer to the true oppressor of the New Testament. Now, for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the biggest oppressor to Christ was who? The Jews. The Jews, God's own people, rejected God's own Son. And it was the very people, you look at Matthew 23, Jesus would say towards the end, as a chick would gather her hens, I would gather you, but you would not have me. And it killed God. God's own people refused God's own remedy. So God's solution was, if my own people aren't going to accept it, I'm going to send my message to a people who were never called my people, and they will become my own, talking about the Gentiles. It's interesting how the center focus of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts chapter 1 and 2, the gospel and the kingdom were started in the very place where the enemies of God were located. And as we progress through the book of Acts and even through the book of Revelation, we find the gospel becoming closer and closer right there where that star is. This is written in French, so good luck reading some of these. But where it says Rome, in the little italics right there, the gospel is getting closer to the oppressor of the church, the greatest oppressor. I think that's interesting. I think God is saying the gospel works best, and it comes closer to the very place that people want it the least. I don't know why it works that way, but that's just how the gospel works. But we see this progression through the book of Acts, and we start seeing some of these mentions of these different political figures on your piece of paper. It mentions Quirinius, which was given a different name. We had just read Pontius Pilate, Lucius, that we might know as Galileo or Gallio, Marcus, Antonius, Felix, we know him as Felix, and then also Porcius Festus, that we know as most noble Festus. Now, there's other Roman officials that are mentioned through here, but again, all we're trying to do before we get into Revelation is what is our time indicator that we're looking at. Now, we had already read some of the Caesar names, but I want you to look a little bit further down the page where it makes mention of the emperors of the Roman Empire. When we get into the book of Revelation, especially chapter 17, and if you were to compare this with Daniel chapter 7, we'll go through this when we get into chapter 17 a little bit more in depth. In Daniel's vision, it mentions a beast with 10 horns. In Revelation 17, it says there was a harlot who was riding on a beast that had 7 heads. And the text, as we've already read, said this woman, this is he who has wisdom. 7 heads or 7 hills. What's interesting is the Roman Empire is also located, or at least Rome is located around 7 distinct hills. I think one of them on the page, that Celio, is actually spelled a little bit differently because it's got different, Salian, I think is it. It's got different names that you might see through history, but these are the 7 hills that we're making reference to. But what I want to look at are the kings, because it makes mention these heads are 7 kings. And he shall bring about the indignation upon the saints. Now, if you go through this list, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, these seems like names, but if you want some books on them, I have books on all of them. Just know that the Roman emperors were morally corrupt. They may have been great political figures, and let's face it, whether it's the president we now have, the president we did have, or the president before him, or even before that guy, or all the presidents we have in general, they're all human beings. They all have flaws. And when we look back at the Roman Empire, all these people have flaws too. There's no such thing as the perfect leader unless you're talking about Christ. Then that's the perfect leader. But in terms of the Roman Empire, they were all morally corrupt. In fact, you read through the book of Revelation, it makes mention that this particular oppressor against the saints just has a lot of moral issues. They're all about doing sinful things and bad things. And the blood of the prophets and the martyrs of God are being thrown upon their heads. They're utterly wicked and despicable people. Now, it might be the case because people would say, well, Revelation's written about persecution on the Christians. Well, historically, you can't necessarily prove that. We'll talk about it as we go through the book, because Jews and Christians were seen as the same religion for the longest time. And it wasn't until we get to this 8th king that's mentioned in verse 11. It's not until about that time that the Roman Empire starts to see, hey, there's something different here than this Jewish sect. And if you look through the book of Acts, you recall how the Jews were trying to get Paul executed and thrown in jail and just stop the apostles from speaking. What the Jews would do, they were trying to make a religious matter a political agenda. And they were throwing that in the face of the government, saying, you need to take care of this, otherwise you're not a friend of Caesar. And they throw it up as if it's a political agenda, but they're using the government for their own gains. And it was wrong. It was wrong to do that, and we even have that today. People make religious matters government issues when they shouldn't even be government issues to begin with. But over time, the Christians start becoming their own sect, and the Roman Empire starts to see this. And this is where we start to see some of those things we commonly hear about. Nero lighting up Christians in his garden, and they would have crosses all throughout his garden, and he would sing songs. And Nero, in fact, is just a crazy maniac of a king. Came to power, I think, when he was 17. He had bisexual ways. He, quote unquote, loved his wife, but then I think he ended up executing his wife. He was messed up overall. Ultimately, he killed himself. But there was a great fire that struck out, I think, in 63 or 62 AD. And Nero blamed it on the Christians. The Christians had burned 3/4 of the sections of Rome where there were 14. And he wasn't all there. But after the death of Nero in 68 AD, there was this rumor that started appearing. And thinking back on the election, there's some skepticism as to processes that occurred. And there are some people who would say, well, that's not my president's still in power. Well, it's interesting, at the death of Nero, there was this thing that's called the Nero Revivus. And it's basically this prophecy that was foretold that Nero's not dead. He's still alive. In fact, he's gone into Persia, and he's going to come back, and he's going to rule over us again. Except the problem was Nero really was dead, and he was not coming back. Which explains at times, as you go through Revelation, where God is making emphasis on himself. I am the one who was, who is, and will be. I am the one who was dead, and now I am alive again. I am the first, I am the last. And it even makes a couple of emphasis on the idea of this God or this Lord who has rule over this despicable moral decay, whatever this society might be. And that's the Roman Empire that we're making reference to. But out of all these kings, I just took a big rabbit hole there. Out of all these kings, there's 5 kings that are mentioned in this order. Now, we're not going to go through Galba, Ortho, or Vitalis on the list. But I want you to look at Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. If you look at all those emperors that are listed through there are exactly 8 emperors right there. Vespasian would be number 6. Titus would be number 7. Domitian is number 8. Now, the reason I don't include Galba, Ortho, and Vitalis, these are particular emperors, and really it depends on which commentator you read. But these emperors ruled less than a year. Galba was obsessed with Nero's death, and in fact, he took a lot of the political generals and he called himself king against what the Senate and what the people wanted. He was executed 7 months later in his reign. The next one, Ortho, he only ruled for 3 months. And then the next one, Vitalis, he only ruled for about 8 months. All these other kings, maybe Titus is the closest one to these 3, and he ruled for a little over 2 years. He would have been the brother of Domitian. But it's interesting. 5 kings were, these first 5 names. We're going to ignore Galba to Vitalis for right now because they didn't rule long enough to actually make a difference. Vespasian definitely would have been one who is. This is Revelation 17. Whatever's going on in Revelation 17, it's going to have something to do with this 6th king. And what's interesting as well, the text is very specific when it says this one who comes after the one who now is. It's very specific of how long he's going to rule. And in fact, it's not long at all. It would say, and when he comes, he must continue for a short time. I think 2 years is a pretty short time. And it's interesting, Domitian, you look at his rule, that's what, 15, 16 years total right there? That's a long time. It's interesting, even in the text, it's going to say when this 8th king comes. I think it even makes reference to him as a beast. Verse 11, the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th and is of the 7 and is going to perdition. Whatever's going to happen that's really bad, it's going to happen with whoever this 8th king is. And at least on this list, it's going to happen under Domitian. Now, I've got a book, and I don't have it on me. I was supposed to bring it because there was a quote I really wanted to read. Domitian was kind of one of those... You ever met an athlete or at least a young guy who's in sports in school and he's all about the sport and it just seems like his mind's not on common everyday things. It's all about the sport and he's all about workout and getting better and all about his stats and all that. He's all about the game. Well, for Domitian, that's him. He doesn't necessarily care about everything else that's going on around him. He just cares about his power and his fame. In fact, out of all the emperors, the Caesars here on this list, Domitian is the first one who was ever called the first ever living God out of all the Roman empires. You're going to read throughout the text of Revelation this idea of those who worship the emperor or worship this image Of the beast, well, when it makes mention of this eighth who is of the seven, the beast that was and is not, this idea that's going to come up throughout Revelation, they're going to worship this idea of this God, whether he's dead or he's alive. It's this particular image of power that these people wanted. And these people are going to say, who can contend with this image? That's the image of the Caesar. And the idea is how do we get away from a God who was living and now is dead, turning to a God who was living, died, yet he rose again? We're going to see that contrast a lot throughout the book of Revelation. Now, I'll talk about that more whenever we get into it, and it makes mention of the mountains down there on the page. Last thing I do want to make mention as we go throughout the book, and we've already mentioned this in our series of lessons for getting the timing of the book. We've already talked about Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, verse 3, chapter 22, verse 6 and 10. Uses two time cuffing phrases. The time is at hand and shortly come to pass. I would even include chapter 17, verse 10, where it says, the one who comes after the one who is, he will reign for a short time. I think that gives us a time indicator as well. These individuals have to be alive during this particular scenario. Otherwise, Revelation has either not happened yet, or it didn't even take place in the first century. So those time cuffs are very important. Now, if you look later on in chapter 1, it makes mention, I want to say verse 20. That may not be it. Might be 11. Let me look at it. I've got the text in front of me. Verse 11, saying, the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, what thou seest, write in a book, and send it unto the seven churches which are in Asia. What tense is that? What tense of verb? Past, present, or future? Present. These churches have to exist, or this book is not in effect yet. Or maybe it happened sometime between the 1st century and the 21st century, and it occurred then. But I would commend to you, after everything at least that we've partially looked at, not in depth, but just mentioned, these churches only existed in the 1st century. Maybe a little bit after, I want to say maybe Sardis is the one, not Sardis, Smyrna, maybe the one that lasted the longest, and I think they made it up to the 3rd or 4th century. All of these churches are no longer in existence, these original ones today. But they did have to exist, otherwise what the Lord is doing is saying, oh, we don't have any churches there. Let's come up with 7 different names of cities that actually exist. And if you look into history, these are cities, every single one of these. There either had to be a church there during this time, or our Lord is a phony, and John is writing these fluke notes out into the brotherhood saying, oh, look at how the church is growing, and oh, they've got problems, but you've got problems too, and you can learn something from these. These had to be real churches. And I think what I'm trying to get at here is, if the kings existed in the 1st century, if the churches that are being mentioned existed in the 1st century, and the things being written through the book must shortly come to pass, and the time is at hand, I think Revelation takes place, at least to the initial audience, in the 1st century. If we keep that in mind, this is going to bring up some difficulty when we see what about the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Well, we need to understand that in the right context. What about the 1,000-year release of Satan on the earth? We need to understand that in the right context. The 144,000, get the right context. What I'm saying is even though this book's going to take place in the 1st century, there are going to be some things throughout the text that will present some difficulties for us to understand. We need to be careful in our interpretation of those. Give them the right amount of time of understanding, of thought, and then by the time we make it to chapter 22, I want you to read the last verse. Well, actually, the last 2 verses. Chapter 22, verse 20. It would say, he who testifies to these things says, surely I am coming quickly. Amen. Even so, come, Lord Jesus. Now, either one of 2 things are going to happen by the end of Revelation. Either one, it's going to be literally the end of the world. Or number 2, It's going to be the end of something that the people in the first century were going through. And something is going to end in a short time span from the writing of this book. I really think it's the latter of the two and not the first. But don't take my word on it. See if that's what the text points towards as we go through this study. Now, I rushed through a lot of that, and I really wish I could have done it a little bit more justice. But any questions on the historical aspect of Revelation? Oh, okay. Well, thank you for your time, your attention. If you think it's credible for you to look into it. If not, then don't. But just know these things must shortly come to pass, whatever those things must be. So, till Sunday morning, thank you all for being with us. Those being live streamed, thank you. And Lord willing, we'll see you Sunday. Thank you.